Hi, and welcome back. Leading off of that discussion into some more depth on the caregiving issues, I'd like to introduce Vicky Shabo at New America, who will be leading our next panel on care progression, career progression and family care. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, it's wonderful to be here with everyone today. I'm sorry I haven't been here for much of the rest of the conference, but really excited to hear about the conversations that you've been having about gender equity and the economy. So our panel now is about family, caregiving, and career progression. My name is Vicky Shabo. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a senior fellow at New America's Better Life Lab. New America is a think and action tank in Washington, D.C., and the Better Life Lab is committed to research and storytelling. I do work that is advocacy related in public policy, focused on work-family justice. I am a senior fellow for paid leave policy and strategy at the Better Life Lab, where I focus on federal and state legislation related to paid family and medical leave, to working with businesses on enhancing their practices and also supporting public policy, working with researchers across gender, racial, and economic justice, and a lot of public speaking and just getting the word out about why the policies that support caregiving in the workplace are just so critically important. I'm really excited to be here today with three terrific panelists who I'm going to introduce and welcome to the virtual stage. We'll then hear from each of them, and then we'll do Q&A. But just to set the framework of what we're talking about before I go ahead, we are at an inflection point here with respect to women and caregiving and work. We've seen the effects of the pandemic, which really only brought to light the structural problems that America was facing before with respect to women's labor force participation, lack of policies around paid leave and childcare and elder care, the impact that has on wages, women's wages and wealth, particularly for women of color. And I know you've talked a lot about that today already. And about the ability of both frontline workers, low-wage workers, hourly workers, and professional workers to get ahead. So this could not be more timely. We are at a really, truly critical moment with respect to federal policy interventions. Right now, as folks know, Congress is looking at a package called the Build Back Better Act, which could be a once-in-a-generation opportunity to really overhaul structures, policies, and supports around childcare, home and community-based care, and care for people with disabilities, household income, especially for families with children, and paid family and medical leave, and finally making historic federal investments in that area. So this couldn't come at a more timely moment, and I'm really thrilled to be here with everyone and for this conversation. So I'm going to welcome the panelists to the virtual stage. First, I'd like to introduce Maria Luengo Prado. She's the Senior Economist and Policy Advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston Research Department. Her research interests include macroeconomics and public economics, and her research focuses on understanding households' composition and savings decisions under uncertainty and the effect of those decisions on the broader economy. So Maria, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And then next, I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Ai-jen Pu at the National Domestic Workers Alliance, where she is the co-founder and executive director. NDWA is a nonprofit organization working to bring quality work, dignity, and fairness to the growing numbers of workers who care and clean in our homes, the majority of whom are immigrants and women of color. In 12 short years, with the help of more than 70 local affiliate organizations and chapters with over 200,000 members, NDWA has passed Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights in 10 states and 2 cities and brought over 2 million home care workers under minimum wage protections. And as a point of personal privilege, I will just say that Ai-jen and I and many others are fighting in the trenches right now to really help improve the federal policy situation. So welcome. And then last, I'd like to introduce Amy Castro, who's an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania in the School of Social Policy and Practice. Amy also serves as primary investigator of the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration under Mayor Michael Tubbs. She's a visiting distinguished professor at Penn School of Nursing an affiliated faculty member at the Alice Paul Center. She was a 2017 recipient of the Excellence in Teaching Award at the School of Public Policy and Practice, where she teaches courses on policy analysis, gender, and impacting government. So welcome to all three of you. Great. So we are going to go into, I guess, around 10 to 12 minute presentations from each of these folks. You'll see that there's a trajectory in what they're talking about. And then we're going to hopefully have a very robust Q&A with all of you, as well as amongst ourselves. So I'm going to go first to Maria. And I'm going to do that because Maria's work really touches on what's happening with labor force participation today, the role of COVID, and the role of caregiving. We'll then go to iGen and then to Edie. So Maria, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Vicky. So in my remarks today, I will first give you a brief summary of some work that I did earlier in the year, comparing the labor market outcomes of men and women up to that date, but I will also provide some commentary on the latest numbers for the month of October that were released on Friday for a more updated picture. I'm a Fed economist, and part of my job is to follow developments in the labor market to inform monetary policy decisions, not only to understand what has happened, but also what is likely to happen is important for when we make decisions about monetary policy. So in my earlier work that I did earlier this year, I used the current population survey, which is the household survey that is used to produce key official statistics, such as the unemployment rate, to actually compare the paths of men and women when it comes to the labor market. I focused on prime age individuals. This is the group of people who are 25 to 54 years old, typically because this group includes individuals that for the most part have already completed their education and also are not thinking of retirement quite yet. So we get a lot of signal from what is happening to this group about what is likely to happen in the near future. And what I documented in a nutshell is that the pandemic was hard for everybody. We had to remember that between February and May 2020, we lost over 22 million jobs. So everybody was impacted to some extent, but women were more impacted, all women initially. And then as months passed, mothers more than other groups of women. So pre-pandemic, despite of decades of progress for women in the labor market, there were still gender gaps in employment and labor force participation that persisted. Just to give you an example, in that age group, while 86% of men work, only 75% of women did. That's about an 11 percentage point gap. In labor force participation, the gap was a little bit larger, about 12 percentage points. If you focus on mothers and fathers, then the gap was even larger. 91% of fathers in this age group work, while only 72% of mothers. So early in the pandemic, women were more likely to left the labor force at higher rates and also lost jobs more than men. So those original gender gaps had already existed, widened. In previous recessions, men were more likely to experience labor loss than women. But this one, and as the economy recovered, typically women will go back to the labor force much faster than men. This was very different this time around, and it has to do with the nature of the pandemic. Women are much more likely to work on high contact occupations than men. Women are also more likely to work in sectors that were most affected by the pandemic, mainly service-related sectors such as education, health service, leisure, and hospitality. Since more jobs were lost in these occupations, more women fared worse initially. After the lockdowns were lifted and the economy starts to recover somewhat in the summer of 2020, we start to see that the paths of women with and without children start to diverge. Women without children close those gender gaps, this is not to say that they went back to the same levels of employment that they had before. Men didn't either, but that gender gap in a way closed. But that was not the case for women with children. So what I show in my work with the statistical tools was the fact that it was really the schools that were causing this divergence. We know that what happened with the schools after the summer finished, or in the summer there is no school, but after the summer, many schools didn't go back to operations normally. Those who have children know that many of our children went to school remotely, or in the best cases, they had hybrid kind of modes. And in the United States, we have had a struggle to provide affordable, high quality early childhood care. But as a parent, you kind of knew that you made it when your kid turned 5 or 6, depending on the time of the year, and you could send them to school, because in this country, schools do not only provide education, but they also provide a lot of hours of children's supervision that allowed mothers to actually participate in the labor market with very little cost. So the pandemic changed all that. The unpredictability of the school operations certainly made parents rethink their situations. And it seems that mothers, more than fathers, bore the cost of this childcare. So why, you might ask? And probably the answer is a complex one. So it could have been just it's probably a combination of bad luck. If mothers were more likely to lose their jobs than fathers because of the nature of the pandemic, it's only natural that the parent that doesn't have a job anymore takes over childcare responsibilities. But that's probably not the whole story, right? So we know that in spite of all the progress that we have made, gender norms are still very strong. Okay, sometimes I struggled with this myself, right? When I go to work, my child was very young and he will say, "Mommy, don't go to work, just stay home with me. I will feel guilty." I asked my husband, "Have you ever felt guilty when you go to work?" And he said, "Never," right? So those are gender norms. And then I think the other factor is probably has to do with gender wage gaps, right? We know that the women are paid less for various reasons. And imagine if only one parent can work, it might make more sense for the parent that can make the most money to do so. And that's for parents that have choices, right? Single parents might not have that choice at all. And I'm not sure how the math on this works, but there seems to be a lot more single mothers than there are single fathers. So maybe these individuals didn't have a choice at all. So if we continue our road through 2021, we know that more schools were operated in person towards the end. Well, in 2020 towards the end, and the summer of 2021 comes. Summers are always bad for working parents because the schools are not in session. But as we were doing analysis at the Fed, we were all very helpful that by August and September, the labor market outcomes of mothers will continue to improve. This was really not the case. And maybe this had to do with the Delta variant throwing a curveball in everybody's plans. Again, more jobs were lost again in services and occupations where women were more likely to be working. So we had a bit of a repeat with this last wave. But this brings us all the way to October. And in October, we had just a jobs report that came out very strong. But nevertheless, we still are about 4.2 million jobs short relative to February 2020. The unemployment rate has come down significantly, and it continues to come down nicely month after month. But we do have a puzzle when it comes to labor force participation, the labor force participation recovered somewhat initially after the first wave of COVID, but then it has since stalled. And it seems that we have kind of lost like 3 million workers somewhere, right? So if we focus in this prime age group that I'm talking about, that accounts for almost 1.4 million of those workers. And of those, women are the majority. 68% of women, almost 1 million women are missing in that age group that used to work before, right? So if we are gonna have an economy that is strong and is fully recovered, then these patterns and these women and in general have to come back to the labor market, have to come back and do so. So this is a bit of a puzzle what is happening, and this is something that we're still trying to understand. Maybe some jobs are completely gone, like some patterns that may have to relate related to automation, or maybe the way we're doing business has changed and will change forever. Partly is possibly childcare. We know that childcare is expensive. A lot of childcare centers have closed, even if schools have come back. What we see right now is the parents of the younger kids that are suffering more right now. And there is kind of like a dual phenomena. What I see in the latest data is that you have the single parents with young kids are not returning to the labor force, maybe because they cannot afford childcare. And then you have this other segment of the population with two parents with school-age children, where these mothers don't seem to be coming back to the labor force, right? And why this is the case and how we can bring them back to the labor force is important. Maybe this is a choice that has to do with rethinking how you want to live after COVID. But from an economic point of view, these women are probably provide a lot of talent. There's a lot of talent out there that we should bring back to the labor market and for the economy to recover, right? Is it really a choice, or is it really that they didn't feel value before, and how we can help this? So at the end of the day, I want to end up my remarks being a little bit positive. I think the pandemic at least has given us an opportunity to rethink many of the issues that were out there, preventing these women and parents in general from participating in the labor market, and rethinking how we organize schools, childcare, work time in a different way would be beneficial for society in general. And I hope something good comes out of this horrible pandemic.
Maria, thank you so much. And thank you to audience members that are already sending in questions. Please keep them coming. So Maria, thank you for that overview and for sort of grounding us in this unique, somewhat puzzling and certainly eye-opening moment of time. I'm going to turn now to Ai-jen Poo. And I think, where I'm guessing Ai-jen's remarks are going to come in is in both grounding us in how we got to this moment with respect to caregiving in particular, how COVID maybe has illuminated some of the challenges, how care work that's paid and family caregiving are tied together, and where we go from here. So Ai-jen, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Vicky. And I feel like there's so much that Maria said to build off of. And in some ways, I'm going to tell a similar story, but from the perspective of care workers and then zoom out. But to say that at the National Domestic Workers Alliance, we represent the workforce who provides caregiving and cleaning services inside of our homes. So it's the nannies, it's the house cleaners, and it's the home care workers who take care of the aging and people with disabilities inside of the home and allow them to live independently in the community. And it's a workforce that is more than 90% women and majority women of color, including many immigrant women. It's the part of the economy with the highest concentration of undocumented immigrant workers of any sector. And it's incredibly important work. It always has been. It's the work that makes everything else possible. And it's always been essential. And I think what the pandemic underscored is that reality, is just how essential this work is to the kind of functioning and the foundation of the economy. And it is incredibly undervalued and insecure work. Among the most insecure, I'd say, in the entire US labor market, in that you have large numbers of people who are working in the cash economy. You have large numbers who have no access to benefits. In fact, 82% of domestic workers had no sick days, no paid sick days going into the pandemic. Most do not have access to healthcare, and most earn poverty wages, the average wage being about $11 an hour. And for home care workers, for example, the work of caring for the aging and people with disabilities in the home context, the average annual income hovers at around $18,000 per year. So imagine trying to support yourself and take care of your family on $18,000 a year. And this is work that by definition can't be done remotely. It has to be done in person. So what we saw in the pandemic was dramatic losses in jobs and income. And then we also saw a set of people continuing to work as essential workers on poverty wages. And in that instance, you saw workers paying out of pocket for safer modes of transportation when there was no access to public transportation. You saw people paying out of pocket for PPE on poverty wages. And meanwhile, majority of domestic workers are also parents of young children. So they also had their kids home from school, struggling with online learning. They had to figure out how they're going to keep the cell phone bill so that kids could get access to online learning. Incredibly impossible choices to keep working, to keep their clients safe, in some cases taking care of the people most vulnerable to the virus itself, while also keeping themselves and their own families safe, many of them also family caregivers for loved ones with disabilities or older adults. So just an incredible pressure cooker for this workforce. And to this day, about 25% of the domestic workforce is still unemployed, and large numbers are underemployed. Those who are working are still not fully working and still looking for more hours of work. And so what I would say here is a few things. Like, there's lots of patterns that Maria named that can be seen in this workforce. One is that care is essential for people to return to work. And the fact that you have a workforce of women who essentially had their own kids to take care of, their own loved ones and family members to take care of, navigating that on poverty wages after also facing in your sector dramatic losses in jobs is just kind of an impossible vortex of crisis. And so you are seeing people having to make the decision about whether to stay home, take care of their kids because they don't earn enough to pay for childcare, or having to stay home because they have somebody with a disability or immune disease to take care of, and they can't risk exposure in person to other families, right? In this time when variants are still and kids aren't fully vaccinated. So all kinds of precarity. And this is also the workforce that every other sector of the workforce is counting on to provide the supportive services that will enable them to get back to work. And so as long as this workforce isn't secured with the care and support and services that they need, it will be impossible for them to work in it from a secure stance, and also for everybody else to have the supportive workforce in the care economy that they need in order to get to work. So all this to say that the care economy is the place of our economy where it's clearest just how interdependent we are, and that it is the foundation of the entire economy. And the reason why we've been talking about it as infrastructure, as one frame to help us understand that when we cannot afford and manage care, when we cannot get access to the care that our families need, this is not a personal failure. This is not because we have the wrong job, we failed to save, we are a bad parent and we should feel guilty, or we are a bad daughter. It is because we have failed as a society to invest in the programs, policies, and workforce we need collectively in order for a 21st century economy to function. And it's not just one policy. It's not just childcare. It's not just paid family and medical leave. It's not just home and community-based services or long-term care. It's all of the above. And that's where the frame of infrastructure is really helpful, because it talks about a whole web of policies, programs, and workers who are essential to the foundation of a 21st century economy. And these programs are not interchangeable. They're all important aspects of a strong foundation of a care economy. And what we have right now with the Build Back Better agenda and this moment in Congress is literally a once in several generations opportunity to invest at scale to the right degree in, and we could argue actually should be even more, but to at scale in our caregiving infrastructure and in a holistic way, in children, in pre-K, in the workforce that supports early childhood education and home and community-based services for the aging population and people with disabilities. Those services, making them more accessible, and paid family and medical leave, which is the connective tissue that allows all of us, whether we're care workers or family caregivers or working families, individuals, to actually know that we can take care of ourselves and our families and continue to have a job. So it's a holistic web of infrastructure that sets us up to actually have more security, and it invests in this part of the foundation where all of these women and women of color have been working in the shadows. It prioritizes an investment in them for the future, for the economic well-being of the future. And that is long overdue. I think we could all agree on that. And it is part of what we must do if we are to have an equitable recovery and to have a fair career progression for women and for everyone in our country. And so it's the first step, and it's a big step, which is why it's so important that the House make its move the week of November 15th, goes to the Senate, gets to the president's desk, so we can all focus on effective implementation and realizing the promise of this generational moment.
Jen, thank you so much. And so much there to follow up on in Q&A. And I'll just add, for one point to add on to that, this isn't just about individual families. It is also about growing the economy, about creating more jobs, about creating more security for people beyond just those who are being helped by these policies. And so there's micro econ effects and macro econ effects and health and economic security and norms that are changing and all of that. And that's why this moment and this opportunity is so important. So thank you. I'm going to next turn it over to Amy Castro, who's going to talk more about interventions and the importance of guaranteed income as well, and how all of this relates to care. So Amy, I'll turn it over to you. And then if folks want to keep putting questions into the chat, we'll turn to a very robust Q&A next.
Great. Thanks so much for that framing to the two prior speakers. It's amazing how all this dovetails. So I just want to talk briefly about some of our findings from Stockton as they pertain specifically to care work. And then I would love to pull that thread forward into the Q&A with any questions that people may have. But for those who aren't familiar with it, sort of, we're all talking about unconditional cash right now. If you work in the economic mobility space, because the child tax credit and a lot of momentum around the idea of cash as a viable path to reduce poverty and close some gaps in income and wealth. But there are some limits, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But prior to sort of our current moment, if we go back in time 3 years ago when we launched the Stockton experiment, just give you the basics of the design, it was $500 a month, each month, guaranteed income, so no strings attached, to 125 randomly selected individuals in the city of Stockton, California. So we've released 1 year worth of data. The data that I'm going to talk about right now comes from the first year of data, which is pre-pandemic. And we have a second round of data that's coming in the spring, which is pandemic data. I just want to talk specifically about how those findings pertain to care work and where we might see some overlap with some of the themes that we're talking about today. So, first, like I said, that money was provided each month on a prepaid debit card. Individuals are free to use it however they like. If folks are interested in seeing that spending data, it's pretty easy to find online. But first, that $500 a month we saw really served for women specifically as a form of paid care work. So for those who had been sort of performing unpaid care work at home, either with children, aging parents, or just in the community, really, taking care of gaps in healthcare, childcare, elder care specifically, it really served to plug some of those holes. And there was this really interesting trajectory that happened with the money. If you're familiar with the way that scarcity works in families that are struggling to make ends meet, there's kind of this constant scarcity battle where financial scarcity generates time scarcity. So there's very little decision making that you can make when you're caught in this spiral of constantly trying to patch together holes in the safety net and holes in your personal finances. So what we saw with Stockton in that care work was, for the first few months, families really stayed in kind of the space that they had been in of chasing with scarcity and really trying to calm down that income volatility in their balance sheets. And then once they were able to sort of reach a point of stasis after a few months where they weren't living in an emergency situation, they were able to then stabilize their household. And we saw really that stability and that liquidity pooled across their social networks and across other families in the neighborhood or in the community. So that's kind of the second thing I just want to make sure that I'm highlighting, is that pooling networks, like the networks that people are living in terms of trying to provide resources to one another, both in a formal way and an informal way, really shaped people's decision-making pathways and their strategies, and really the scale of risk-taking that they were going to take. Now, although Stockton's a small experiment, what we really learned was how that burden of care work that spread across financially fragile networks really shapes how people interact with cash. So at a moment when we're talking about building back better, whatever that may mean, and we're actually front loading care work in a meaningful way while also talking about unconditional cash, I think it's important to think about the ways in which families live in community. They live in reciprocal networks. They don't necessarily live in the way that we count them in a data set. And we really saw that money served as a way to patch those holes and networks in ways that others necessarily didn't see. So most of the families who were in our experiment really kept their participation quiet. Most people that they were sharing money and resources with had no idea that they were members of the treatment group whatsoever. But what we saw specifically was that as food instability would stabilize in the household that was receiving the cash, we actually saw food security spread out amongst their network from other family members or people in the neighborhood, where they would typically need to buy or borrow food, at the end of the month when food stamps ran out, which is sort of, kind of obvious that you would expect that to take place. But what was really important here when we think about care work is we've received a lot of press over our shifts in employment, right? So if you're familiar at all with the Stockton Project, there's been a fair degree of excitement or naysayers, depending on how you look at it, over people who moved from underemployment or part-time employment to full employment throughout the duration of the experiment. So the beginning of the experiment, 28% of people in the treatment group were experiencing full-time employment. After 1 year, that number went up to 40%. We did not see the same shifts take place in the control group. When we went and interviewed people to determine why did this happen, right? What happens when you give people money and then they end up, in a stronger position of employment than they did prior, right? Is that people really described they were able to take risks that they could not take prior because they had a cushion that they could jump off of. Now, while on the face of it, that might not really seem like a care work issue, it absolutely is. Because what we saw was that as that scarcity went down, the anxiety went down of, struggling to make ends meet, people were able to take a breath and set new goals and alternative pathways for themselves, in some cases that involved employment. But for women, and specifically for those who had an unequal burden of unpaid care work, there were real limits to the risks that they could take. So even if they had more liquidity because they had that cash on hand, it didn't resolve the problem of lack of affordable childcare, for instance, right? Is that $500 a month is not going to equate daycare. And so thinking about when we're talking about cash at the same time that we're talking about care work policies, we need to really think about the ways in which cash is limited when we don't take into account gender and when we don't take into account the burden of unpaid care work and how it keeps people out of the workforce or it pushes them in some dangerous scenarios, which the previous speaker just spoke about. The other finding that we had that was really interesting was these shifts in vulnerability. So, one participant that I spoke to put it this way. She said, poverty means lack of choice. You're forced in ways you don't want to be. So, that sort of, if you are struggling to make ends meet, you are forced into a vulnerable position with people, systems, relationships that you might not want to be in otherwise. And those systems oftentimes invite surveillance. Now, care work is really the landscape in which these themes play out, especially when we're talking about things like childcare, where moms are describing, I don't want to leave my kid in this particular situation. I don't want to necessarily stay in this relationship, but I don't have a choice. And what we saw with Stockton was that even with something as small as $500 a month, it disrupted that cycle in small ways and allowed women to move, in some cases men, but more specifically women, to move out of forced vulnerability into chosen vulnerability, meaning they were then able to step into mutual reciprocal relationships with cash and with goods that they wanted to be in, where there's a sense of agency and self-determination. And so we tend to think about cash in isolation from these other themes. But when we think about the broader system that is both targeting women for risky products and then limiting their capacity for wealth building, we can't pull that conversation outside the conversation of care worker cash. And the last thing I'll say on this, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to cover some of these themes in the Q&A, is some of the limits, right? So when we think about unconditional cash, yes, it provides a way to cover care work for people who wouldn't have it otherwise, right? Yes, it provides a bit more liquidity in people's individual bank accounts, right? But there's limits. I spoke first about the lack of affordable childcare, and that's the big one, right? And so we saw that the money really alleviated strain in off the books childcare, paying family and friends to cover those needs for families. But it didn't necessarily open up a path to full-time, safe and affordable daycare, pre-K, things of that nature. And then most importantly, cash does not eliminate structural barriers to wealth building that are tied to gender, okay? So I could wave a wand tomorrow, give everyone in the United States $1,000 a month. It does not matter if you don't have access to safe banking and you don't have access to policies that are going to protect that wealth from, scrupulous actors that are looking to, to pull it out. So I just kind of want to land there and end there with saying, when we're talking about care work, we can't talk about it absent from the conversation around cash, nor can we talk about it absent from this broader conversation of, wealth building and whether or not women have safe access to systems that allow them to accumulate wealth over generations. And I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Amy, thank you so much. And thanks to Maria and Ijen as well for putting so much on the table here. I think we've got themes around income, security, job quality, structural barriers, racism, sexism, the role of culture in how we treat people of different genders, and how that might hold women in particular back. So lots and lots to dig into here. Please keep the questions coming in the chat. But I'm going to turn it over. I know Ijen's got to leave us a few minutes early, so I'm going to just go first to a very specific question that came in for her, which is just an international comparison here. One of our audience members is asking whether there's any country that better supports care economy workers. And I'm interested in that too, and how much that's a specific intervention that countries have created, or whether it's really just bound up in other protections and supports and income and systems. So Ijen, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I'll have to admit here that I'm not an international expert, but I will say that when I do work with our international colleagues, it is pretty much across the board that while some countries are better in terms of their care infrastructure, they offer more supports when it comes to access to childcare, or universal long-term care might be universally accessible for older adults and people with disabilities. That pretty much across the board, the care workforce, and in some places they're called carers, is undervalued and insecure. And it's a place where women of marginalized social status are concentrated. There's always migrant workers, very poor women who do this work. And so it is a global crisis in terms of the quality of these jobs. And it's just worth noting that there's a lot of conversation about the future of work and jobs as it relates to automation and artificial intelligence. There's a lot that we
Oh, is iGen frozen for other people?
Yes.
Oh, and maybe she's.
could make
Oh,
these.
you're back.
Oh, sorry, where did I?
You
I'm sorry.
froze maybe a minute ago.
Oh no, okay. Well, I was just saying that these are jobs that can't be automated, at least anytime soon, or outsourced. They're jobs that we know we need for the foreseeable future. So they are a safe as a place to invest in the creation of good jobs for the 21st century, regardless of what will happen as technology unfolds. So this is a place where we could be global leaders in establishing a pathway to good work in the care economy. And I would love to see us do that.
Does anybody else, either of our other two panelists, have insights on this sort of international comparison as well before we move on? Okay. So we have a question here about paid family and medical leave, which I may just answer. The question is whether there have been any studies or research on paid leave for all genders and family structures, and whether equitable paid leave programs help balance family life in different or more improved ways than programs that provide only leave for birthing parents, such as short-term disability. So I'll kick us off and then welcome folks to chime in. Yes, there's a lot of research actually about how gender equal paid leave both encourages men to take leave, particularly to care for children and for loved ones. In California, for example, when California's paid family leave program started in 2004, men were about 17% of parental leave takers, and it's now more than 40% of birthing claims for new parents that are men. We've also learned a lot about how programs can be structured in terms of wage replacement, in terms of maximum benefit, in terms of family members who are covered for family care to help even out the load so that the load is not falling just on women, so that leave is accessible to lower wage workers as well as to higher wage workers. And in terms of equitable leave programs that include more than just parental leave, all of the states that have passed paid family and medical leave programs in the US, of which there are now 9, plus the District of Columbia, 7 of those are now in place and the other 3 are coming soon. All of those include personal medical leave, family caregiving leave for a seriously ill, injured, or disabled family member, and parental leave. And what we see is that having all of those purposes cuts down on stigma and bias. It creates more opportunities for gender equal leave. In Rhode Island, for example, men take more family caregiving leave, in part because that population might be older. Lots and lots of evidence about access to paid leave and return to work, access to paid leave and higher earnings, both for new parents and for family caregivers, and impacts for businesses as well in terms of reduced turnover. greater productivity, morale, ROI, and things like that. So short-term disability insurance, while it's one of the ways in which new, birthing parents have access to paid leave, it's certainly not the model for the kind of equitable, sort of family-forward, economy-friendly caregiving that we want to help to create in the country. And so I turn it over to others for either experiential or qualitative or quantitative evidence on this point as well. And like Ai-jen said, as we're thinking about care economy policies writ large, paid leave is really the one that is the glue, that's the connective tissue that serves both paid caregivers and family members, helps to create greater stability for family caregiving situations where you need to get somebody into a new care situation or find a paid caregiver. This is a piece that's often under discussed. When paid leave comes up, people often think about moms and babies, but it really is so much more than that. Parental leave is just about 25% of all of the claims of Family and Medical Leave Act leave taking each year. Family caregiving is about another 25%, and personal medical leave is about half. And so these pieces really do fit together in people's lives. So another question here, and I think if we could just sort of go down the line on this one, and then Ai-jen, I know you need to leave us pretty soon, which is sad. But how do you see caregiving evolving in the recovery? Are you hopeful that women and other caregivers who left the workforce and wish to return will be able to return to the same level that they were at before? I think this is really a $1 billion or several $100 billion question that is before us right now. So who'd like to start?
I
Go
can
ahead,
go
Maria.
first. It's fine. I don't know. I think we should take this opportunity to also rethink about how much we need to work and we want to work, right? So I think like for many years, like we have thought that like we haven't made any changes to our number of hours and that we work, right? We have been stuck in this 40-hour a week work schedule for full time. We know that many countries across the world are not in that situation, right? I grew up in Europe where the work week is not 40 hours a week, like the norm is something lower. And we have to think that sometimes like maybe we're not as productive as we could do the same things that we do in a reduced amount of time if we were coordinated in a way to be able to do that. So maybe this is an opportunity to think that maybe it is not that we should go back to the level where we were before. Certainly there are professions where that might be the case and you may need to work this amount of hours, but there are other places where we might be equally productive by just concentrating our effort and being very focused at what we do on certain times of the day or the week. So I think you have to think about this in a broader way, right? That maybe we shouldn't aim at going back to where we were, that maybe we're at a juncture where we can think about like what productivity is and what face time is as opposed to real productive time. That's one thing that I want to put in there, right? So I let the other panelists who may have different opinions build from this.
I think I'll have to think about that one, Maria. But I do, in the moment, I do believe that that having the freedom and the supports to work, should you need to and or want to, is what we're trying to build here with the care infrastructure and with our systems and programs. And so that it can be a real choice to work less or more, or, that there is a way in which we our version of freedom in this country is not yet realized because there's too many people who don't have the freedom to not work and or to care for their families while they're working. Like, there's so many ways in which the lack of our caregiving investments and infrastructure has created a set of choices that that shouldn't be impossible choices, essentially. And so I think that what we have here is the opportunity, and part of the challenge thus far in building a care infrastructure that works is a lack of funding. And what we have in this moment is the ability to invest in these programs such that we can actually modernize them, make them work more efficiently, establish new ones like paid family and medical leave that we have needed for so very long, and to begin to put the building blocks into place for that long-term infrastructure that will allow us to actually realize this kind of idea of real choice and freedom in our economy. And that's where I feel like we are, is like trying to break free of the austerity and the scarcity culture that we've been in, particularly as it relates to caregiving, and really beginning to invest in our programs, in our workforce, in women and their ability to work, should they choose to, and putting the foundational infrastructure in place. And I think that we can't underestimate the shift in terms of orientation and attitude, like when we actually do have the resources and the investments in these programs, what can be possible in our economy and in our culture.
Oh, can I answer this question 2 or 3 weeks, when we know it's going to happen? If past data is any indicator, which it can be to a point, right, is that we know that when women leave the workforce for care work needs, they typically do not return to the same status, right? So even if they we have the opportunity to come back, right, whether or not they're given access to the same level of, income is an open question, and previous data shows that that's pretty unlikely. So unless the pandemic is going to be that big of a deviation, it's very unlikely that the women who left the workforce during the pandemic because they did not have childcare are going to be able to return to the same level, even if they want to, even if they have safe access to childcare and they've got paid family medical leave, because those are band-aids, right? Like, inequality has inertia. Okay, so even though we're coming back with this amazing set of policies, which fingers crossed will pass, right? It doesn't erase all the wealth that was eroded during the Great Recession. It doesn't erase the fact that when we look at, if I had time, I'd talk more about the data of, those who saw their wealth eroded, women specifically, during the Great Recession, is that before we even hit the pandemic, early baby boomers specifically saw losses in wealth that we literally reversed the gains of the civil rights movement and the women's movement. And so we started out with a loss in wealth that was pretty acute and pretty sharp. And we know that employment is tied to wealth building in many ways, but for many women, their assets are property bound. And so, yes, I'm hopeful that we'll see people return to, women specifically return to the workforce if they have adequate supports and if they choose to do so. But I'm no fool to think that gender bias is somehow erased because we're in a pandemic. And I'll be curious to see what type of data comes out in the coming years as to the ways in which the pandemic was used as an excuse to push women out of the workforce because they had care work needs at home. I won't be surprised if that happens. Don't want to be like doom and gloom about it, but also want to be really realistic about the spaces that people who are marginalized find themselves within when we're talking about the workforce. So I don't know. I also wish I could answer in 2 weeks. We had a better sense of what was going to happen, not just on the federal level, but the state level as well.
Yeah, well, and I think too, the distinction between Maria's answer and iJen's answer, and maybe where you are, Amy, really comes down to this question of economic security and income and the kind of job that you have, the kind of cushion that you have, the kind of employment situation, how your employment situation has sort of taken COVID into account, and how norms of work and remote work, flexible work have or haven't changed or been incorporated into a work situation, and how that plays out even within one workplace for different categories of workers. which I think is the stratification within workplaces is something that's always been really interesting to me because of how even it plays out with respect to paid leave and how professional workers might often have a lot of paid leave paid at a higher rate for a longer period of time than a support worker, than a contract worker in the same place. And this is replicated all over in all sorts of different workplaces. So I'm gonna next turn, actually, Amy, there's a specific question for you here, which is there a difference in the way that women and men use their $500 allotment? I actually noticed when you were talking about childcare, you sort of talked about women and childcare costs, which has always struck me. It's not you, it's endemic to the conversation about how women's paychecks go to childcare, or in this case, how women's guaranteed income, could be spent on care work. Why not everybody's? But our audience question is whether women spent their allotment towards different things than men did. Purchases of cars, computers, where did those come in, as opposed to other basic expenses?
Yeah, so we haven't released really specific data on sort of breaking down the spending by gender. So that I couldn't speak to sort of on a granular way, but certainly, what I can say is that what you would expect to see in terms of the gender distribution of unpaid care work really does drive the resources that the way people are able to deploy their resources. So each month in Stockton, and we saw this go up a little bit going into the pandemic when people were trying to shelter in place, 40%, regardless of gender or anything else, 40% of the money was spent on food, which I think is really, really telling. Just the level of food insecurity and just the ways in which people were able to deal with that food insecurity and then still open up alternative pathways for themselves, I think is pretty telling. But yeah, we haven't released that in a granular way. I don't know that we will or we won't. I'd have to think about it a little bit.
Fascinating. Great. There is a question here. So a lot of our conversation has focused on women, the assumption that all adults in a household need to be working. And for sure that is true in most two adult households and in single parent households. But we have a question here about whether people who would prefer to be stay-at-home caretakers have been undervalued in this conversation, and whether this particular segment of the population may have been crowded out in current policy discussions. So I'll kick it to
Without
you.
question, right? And this is why I think the child tax credit is so crucial, is that unpaid work at home, that social reproductive space is what keeps the labor market moving. And they have absolutely been undervalued. And I think, for those of us who identify as being progressive or being on the left, when we don't talk about that, I think we shut down opportunities for coalition building, and finding ways to build bridges with others. But I'm sure that Maria is going to have a much more nuanced answer to that than I do.
I don't think so, but my opinion is very similar to yours. It should be a choice, right? But is it really a choice? Is it really what you want to do? That at the end of the day comes to that, right? And that's like I don't want my other comment to be misinterpreted. But throughout the life cycle of women, you may wanna. I think being completely outside of the labor force is not good for anybody. As Amy was pointing out before, like when you get completely disconnected, it's very hard to come back, if you come back at all. So making that choice of being home with your children forever while you should have it, and I think is fantastic. If you want to do it, you should do it. You should be protecting yourself as a woman as well, right? Because if you made the effort of like putting yourself through education and you haven't had that chance to build a human capital to later join the labor force when your kids are not home anymore, like the opportunity cost is very large, right? Like the chances that your marriage is not going to end up well, unfortunately, are high for many women. And then many of these women find themselves in very precarious situations when they face retirement and situations like that. So that's why I think it is important to keep some sort of like attachment to the labor force, even you don't want to work 40 hours a week, still just being able to develop some sort of human capital at certain times of your life cycle, I think is very important. So, and I think if it was something that it was possible, and there wasn't a penalty for like working part-time that is so large in this country, right? So many women like work part-time and then do not get rewarded like the way they should be. So that's an issue. Then they may think, well, it's not worthwhile that I work right now. I'm going to stay home with my kids. Like, so I just want to tell these women that, yeah, it is your choice, but you really have to think about the implications of this choice that you're making right now, which is very important. Your kids are going to really appreciate having you home. My kid certainly likes when I'm with him. But you have to think of the long-term perspective from your life as well, and having the choice to do whatever you want is an important one, but I want women should be informed about like the opportunity the cost of these choices, right? But I fully agree that if this is the choice you want to make, you should be able to make it, and some of the fabric of the reforms that we're talking about right now will certainly benefit these women as well.
Well, and just to round out that conversation too, if we were really imagining policy supports that valued the unpaid care, currently unpaid care, you would think about things like Social Security caregiving credits, so that people who aren't in the labor force get credits towards Social Security that reflect the unpaid care that they're providing or their time out of the workforce. You would think about other ways of valuing the unpaid care, and we would think about raising wages for people who are in the labor force so that one adult in a household could be able to support that household. And we haven't made those policy choices. And so we're now in this moment of scarcity, like Amy was talking about, where a lot of times, families have no choices, particularly in the pandemic. I would get a lot of questions from reporters about sort of the stress of returning to the workplace. And often it was important to pivot back to the journalists to say, well, a lot of people have been showing up to their workplaces throughout the whole pandemic, whether they're frontline healthcare workers or frontline grocery store workers, or retail workers or warehouse workers or food delivery drivers. And they're doing that in part because they can't afford not to work and don't have jobs that offer those flexibility. So if we really want to think about valuing stay-at-home care and the ability of families to afford that, we need to think really about valuing unpaid care and better remunerating paid care or paid work in general. So we have another question here. I'm sorry, iGen has left, but we will muddle through. The audience question is the observation that there's a view that the caregiving industry is largely an unskilled workforce. And so how do we begin to change that perception? I don't know if either of you want to jump in, or I'm happy to jump in.
I mean, this is really a question for iGen, but to me, we put dollar amounts on what we value, right? Like budgets are moral documents, they just are. And so if we're going to talk about, changing the perception of who is in that field, it really comes down to money. And like, not to be crass about it, but when we sort of like, those of us are sort of out here making the case for that, and then asking the broader question of like, well, what businesses are we supporting and to what degree are we paying folks? I think that's pretty crucial, but I don't think we can shift that conversation from where I sit without actually attaching wages that demonstrate what people provide in terms of care work, both paid and unpaid.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll say, so the Build Back Better Act includes funding both for childcare and for elder care, for home and community-based care. And part of that funding should go, if the dollar amounts are high enough, to raising the wages of caregivers. And the theory is that if you raise wages for caregivers, you'll have more retention in those jobs. There'll be efforts to make those jobs higher skilled, and that there will be a virtuous cycle of better valuing care, paying care workers more, creating more professionalized caregiving workforces, both for children and for elder care. We've only got about 6 minutes left, and I'm curious, sort of where do you see research going from here? What research questions do you think we might be able to answer as a result of this unique moment that we're in and the aftermath that we maybe haven't been able to answer or investigate before? Is there anything from where each of you sit with your incredible wealth of knowledge and the research that you're immersed in that you want to see or investigate as a result of where we are right now? Maria, I'll start with you.
All right, so I guess this will depend on the imagination of the researcher, but I think it will be, there is a potential for many, many research questions here, right? So we had this like big experiment, right? Like we from the perspective of like how the culture of work might change and how what elements of this flexibility about certain jobs will be retained, right? And how it will affect the careers of men and women who potentially have the ability to take advantage of those new added flexibility, which one will stay, which one will go. We have had incredible amount of support from the public sector, right? Like we're at a juncture where people have been able to build assets to some extent through stimulus payments. And we know that we haven't spent all of that money yet. And what are they doing with it? And are they investing on themselves? Are people going to be able to make better choices? This is probably a misline of research, right? Where they're going to be able to see if people are going to be investing and making better choices when they are not faced with those scarcity situations that make you put you in a bad decision framework, right? So those are just like a few of the things that I see that are low-hanging fruit, but I'm sure that there will be many other research questions out there.
Oh, it's such a big question. It's difficult to sort of say it in a succinct way. But a few things. So I spoke today specifically about Stockton, but Stockton was really just the start. There is a proliferation right now of pilots and experiments with unconditional cash that are taking place all over the United States. I mean, well over 100. And within my center alone, I think my staff are probably going to yell at me if they're get this number wrong, but I think we're somewhere at 28 experiments across the US, in various stages of launching. And so thinking about like the questions that we can ask about cash within different policy subsystems to me is crucial, right? So as we've had this lack of support on the federal level around things that pertain to care work, what we have seen is some tremendous innovation on a local level and on a mayoral level. And so seeing the ways that cash can work in different systems where we have differential access to supports, differential access to programming that may or may not be, helpful to women specifically when it comes to unpaid care work, paid family and medical leave, and thinking about that alongside some of the really robust work that's been done in communities by, led by largely iGen's organization of looking at people who are organizing around these issues, seeing how far can cash go from one context to another, to me is going to be really crucial. And then sort of on a 20,000 foot view, I can't help but think about deservedness, right? Is that on the one hand, the pandemic is a disaster, right? Like we have eroded wealth. We've made people extremely vulnerable. There's been a tremendous loss of life, and how this is going to impact people's mental health in the long run is really an open question, and how families are absorbing that is really an open question. But on the other hand, we are at this incredible inflection point, which I think is the way that you framed it at the very beginning, Vicki, where we are actually saying, is this the country we want to live in? Really? Is this really where we want to be? And so there's things on the table right now politically and in terms of the policy space that were just ideas that we hoped maybe one day would be on the table that suddenly are all right here at this particular moment in time. So when I think about that, as a researcher, I think it challenges me to say, how do I take advantage of this policy moment? Do I wait, or do I come up with the new ways of thinking about my research methods that push on that public conversation, take advantage of that policy window, and maybe think more flexibly about the way that I do research? And I know that's something that me and my team are consistently thinking about, and others are as well, is saying, hey, we have this policy moment where we are suddenly talking about deservedness and poverty and strain in a way that we haven't before, but it's not going to stay here, right? As the middle class recovers and as white folks recover, we will stop talking about it. We'll stop talking about care work when the economy is running again. And so I hope that those things, stay on the table, and I would challenge us as researchers to keep them there.
Great. Well, thank you for a fantastic discussion. Jen, in absentia, Amy and Maria. I am going to turn it back to Jennifer, and I believe they're getting ready for another session. So thank you all. This has been great.
Thank you, Vicki, and thank you everyone on the panel. That was a really robust discussion. We're going to take a short break and reconvene at 3:15 p.m. Eastern Time for our discussion on wealth and retirement. Thank you.